Hey guys, thanks for joining me today. We'll be discussing modular and reusable front-end code with HTML5, HAML, and Sass. HTML5, well, some HAML, Sass and CoffeeScript. I kind of tricked you there by getting you in here, luring you with a Sass and CoffeeScript bit. These principles you can apply to vanilla CSS or vanilla JavaScript as well. This is kind of boring. So we're switching to the joy of front-end, a journey with Bob Ross and me. Now I found out that Bob Ross, a painter, isn't well known in Poland. So I'll just show you one of his paintings. This is a painting by Bob. Bob is the inventor of modular painting. He used to have a TV show, and he did those paintings in 30 minutes. So he had these modules. He had what do you call a happy little tree, a crooked tree, a mountain, a lake, a cloud, and he would just take those elements and in half an hour time create a new painting with those elements. This is Bob. Bob was this white guy with an afro. He was really likable. He had this soft voice, and as a kid, I used to watch Bob Ross, and I loved it. Just as Bob, us developers like to start with a blank canvas. This isn't a Ruby talk per se, but I know you guys work in Rails and other environments where you need to implement front-end code. You have your code, and you don't always want to use Bootstrap, so you need to come up with something else. So we start with our blank canvas, and we're going to do it right this time. Like, no hacky code. This is going to be awesome. So you go at it for a few weeks, like Bob Ross riding a unicorn through a sky of rainbows. I actually just went to Google and entered Bob Ross unicorn rainbows. Everything exists on the internet. It's awesome. And you expect something like this. You just code for like 3 weeks, and you take a step back, and you look at your code, and you're expecting your code to look like this immaculate Bob Ross painting. But you're greeted with something that looks more like a dead rat lying beside a puddle of cat vomit. That's not what we want, and that's what we're going to solve today. So how did this come about? You started simple. You just had this H1, and you wanted it to be black. So you, in your CSS, you said, well, this H1, make it black. Well, not always. When it's in the main or sidebar container, you wanted it to be blue and an italic, so you just made that exception. All good. Oh, no, wait. When in the Twitter widget, you just made it red, and then you have to use important, otherwise this one, which has a higher specificity, would be active. So you want it to be red. Still fairly clean. Oh, no, wait. When the tweets are in the sidebar, it has to be green. So, well, you just add this, and this just builds up. Oh, wait, no, wait. It's just once. Just this one time it has to be magenta. So then you just add a class name to the H1, and you're fine. This is how you get code looking like dead rats laying next to puddles of cat vomit. As Bob would say, oh, you'd be in Agony City by now. Who will be lying to you today? My name is Roy. You can find me on Twitter as Roy. I'm co-founder of ATBeans, Ruby consultancy in Amsterdam, and co-founder of Slicecraft, the only company globally offering PSD to HAML, Sass, Compose, and CoffeeScript services. I'm a front-end architect on projects small to humongous. I have 12 years of front-end experience, of which the last 7 on Ruby on Rails projects. And I've done over 100 projects using the principle I'm about to tell you about, using HAML and Sass. So what we'll be talking about is how to structure your HTML for reusability, how to bind styling and behavior to your HTML in a way of which I think you would run into the least problems when it comes to changing HTML in favor of your JavaScript and in favor of your CSS and not breaking your tests, and how to structure your code and files so you're actually able to find your way around. First off, we need to stop thinking about a web page as a page. A web page is nothing more than a collection of modules. Let's go back to Bob for a bit. Bob was born in Florida, and when he was 18, he joined the Air Force and got stationed at Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska. Bob, this is the entrance to the base. Bob must have passed this hundreds of times. They didn't have a website back then, but right now, this is the hideous website of the Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska. It consists entirely of tables. No, we don't do that anymore. Anyway, don't look at it as a whole page. Look at it like this. These are modules which you can reuse throughout your project. You should be able to take a module, have it in your main container, have it in your sidebar. Stuff should just work. Move it into another div, and it should just work. Especially if you have a team where you work with front-end developers and back-end developers. As a back-end developer, you want to be able to take this HTML structure, apply a CSS class to it, and just expect it to work. For that, I use HTML5, which rocks. Let me take a sip of water. This used to be our document outline in HTML4. Your document outline is the way you structure your containers, which used to be divs, etc., and how you use your headings, H1 to H6 in there. What we used to do is have one H1. Then we have some containers. We just go down. We have an H2, an H3, multiple H2s, but we always had one H1. This is shitty because if you take this sidebar container and you want to use it somewhere else, maybe it needs to be an H3 there. So you need to keep track of this cascade in H1, H2, H3, etc. That's solved on the HTML5 document outline where we have more sectioning elements, a site, section, body itself, article, for instance, and all those sections can start with an H1, which is great if you want to reuse partials or reuse some of your code. The new sectioning elements are great, but you don't want to go replace all your divs. Don't take all your divs and turn them into sectioning elements, because some of those are just divs. You need them just for styling purposes, or as a hook to apply JavaScript to, or whatever. So be cautious with that. Use new elements semantically. Now, all those sections can start with an H1. Like I said, that's awesome. It makes them great partials, so you can reuse your code. HTML5 doesn't work, or it works everywhere, but you can't style it in older IE versions, because IE doesn't recognize the new elements, and it can only apply styling in your CSS to elements it actually knows about. So for that, you'll need HTML5 shift or modernizer, which has some added benefits. Just drop it in your project and it will work. So HTML5 can be used in the wild, as you probably are all well aware of. Yeah, then you have the SEO experts. Yeah, screw them. I have worked with a lot of guys who told me, no, you can use HTML5, but make sure you only use one H1. Make sure you cascade them, H1, H2, blah, blah, blah. And I asked them why. It's like, because we use that HTML5 document outline. Yeah, Google doesn't like it. I said, well, prove it to me. We don't have to, because we're professionals. I think it's bullshit. Google uses HTML5 in their apps. I've worked on a lot of websites employing HTML5. There are in Google. They rank pretty well, not because of HTML5 and not because they're either using it or not using it. So I would say screw the SEO experts when it comes to HTML5, and just screw them in general as well. You can just use those H1s. As Bob would say, you can do anything you want to do. This is your world. And while I take a sip of water, let's just stand back, relax, and enjoy this Bob Ross painting. See how I used the number 5 brush there to gently? Man, the guy was a genius. So, modular CSS. This is what you want, because you've been using it in Bootstrap somewhat. I have a kind of similar approach, but not entirely. Bootstrap is great, but you don't want all of your apps to look like Bootstrap. But still you want to be able to reuse your front-end code, your styling, and apply that easily if you're a back-end developer. So where do you start if you want to do this? Sorry for that. Find a proper designer. A designer needs to get that their design is meant to be reused throughout an application. They shouldn't remake the same element 3 times, just slightly different. Make sure that the design is suitable to be reused throughout your project. You may have to throw out your existing code. Refactoring your code to employ this new model is kind of hard. So you may want to skip that and just either throw it out or just start using this on a new project. Or not use it at all and just think I'm an idiot, like telling you bullshit. Kill trees by printing your designs. It may not work for you. It works for me to just take all those templates that a designer sends me, print them out, put them on the wall, take a Sharpie, and go over them, and anything that is also visible on the previous page, just black it out so you know what unique elements you're left with. You could ask your designer to condense everything into one page with all unique elements. In my experience, they're not real good at that, so just have them make those templates as they usually would and find the common elements yourself. Now, when writing code, each model gets its own scope. I will illustrate this with some sample code in a bit. You want to use generic class names. If you have this list of articles, which can be related articles, latest news, you don't want to use the class name news on that element because it may also contain other kind of articles, so be generic there. I always use plural class names for collections. If you have tweets, multiple tweets in a container, I use tweets. And a tweet is a tweet. Kind of makes sense. And I like to use class names instead of IDs, simply because something may seem unique right now. In the end, you need the same element or element that looks the same twice on a page. And then if you go to w3clove.com, it won't validate because you're using the same ID multiple times. I'm also not using it because I use classes exclusively to bind my styling on and IDs for JavaScript. Well, I'll get to that in a bit. And use shadow selectors. You don't want to go nest your selectors too deep, like in the examples in the beginning. This ID main, hash main, sidebar, .twitter, h1, that's too specific. So create shadow selectors so you can actually reuse them without running in specificity issues. So here's the scoping example. There's a section with the class name articles. Within there is an h1, because we start them with an h1. And then there is an article. You can have multiple articles, obviously. That's on top. On the bottom is the Sass I use in this case. I like this Sass syntax because with the curly brackets, it wouldn't fit the slide. So the articles has a gray background, and the articles themselves have blue text. This is a shadow selector, so now you can just take any container, give the class name articles, use it throughout your application, and it will just work. This is a very basic example, but you can apply basically all your styling to this, especially if you don't define the width or use 100%. You can use it in your main container. You can have it in a more narrow sidebar, and it will just work, which is also great when you go into adaptive development or responsive design, and you want stuff to scale based on the client someone is using or a device. Your iPhone screen is more narrow than your iPad. This not defining width leads you to being able to have the stuff just all scale. Pretty much what Bootstrap does. For nested modules, you sometimes want to apply slightly different styling when in the sidebar. You want smaller text, or you want it within a media query when you're doing adaptive design. Don't use nested selectors. So don't say, well, articles have a gray background, unless they're in the sidebar, when I want them to be more narrow, and then I want them to have a yellow background. So then you would do .articles, And you make a second selector, which would be a site, if you use HTML5 element, space, dot articles, because then it's limited to your site again. So just add a second class name. Just have default styling for articles, unless you add a second class name, as you see in the top example, unless you say section, articles, space narrow. That works really well in my experience. So what about buttons, etc.? Again, use super shallow selectors. You want to be able to use your buttons everywhere, also in other modules, because your buttons will appear throughout your application. Code in a bit. Don't limit them to specific HTML elements. So don't write a.button, because you want to apply that styling later on to a submit button, for instance. So keep that as shallow and as simple as possible. And for variations, describe the different in the second class. As we see here, this is a button. It has white text and a red background. And sometimes it has a blue background. Class name should be semantic. So it should be semantically correct. So you want to describe what it is and not what it looks like. So that's why I have the first class name describe what it is. In this case, well, something that's styled like a button. But the only difference is the color. So it's probably safest to just use that second selector to describe what it looks like and what the difference is there, instead of describing what it is, because it is exactly the same but in a different color. So while I agree that your class name should be semantically correct, I also believe here it's a pretty good practice to use a second class name to define how it looks. So this is the HTML that comes with it. You have a button inside an article. You have a blue button for another article. And this just works. You could have this in your site. You could have this anywhere, basically. Again, as you're used to with Bootstrap, apply this class name, and the stuff works. Those buttons work everywhere. As Bob would say, this is the hardest part of this method. If you can do this, you can do anything. You need to develop this mindset in which you recognize modules, recognize what the smallest common denominator is, what can be reused, what can be reused. When you get that, it's really easy to apply this method and make truly reusable styling. Wow. Mind is blown. This is like trees with a lake just behind the lake. Friggin' amazing. The guy has been aired in like over 50 countries worldwide. Like his show used to be on TV in over 50 countries. Has anyone ever seen him being aired in Poland, like Bob Ross? Has he been on Polish TV?
I don't think he has.
Man, you kind of like, you've missed out. It's like, oh, I feel so sorry for you guys. Wow, touching, it's touching. Anyway, modular JavaScript. You have to bind your JavaScript to your HTML usually. When someone clicks something, something happens. You have events that are often bind to your HTML. I always suggest using class names for CSS and IDs for JavaScript. This has the, and if not unique, use data attributes. Or you could use, if you use Rails DOM ID, for instance. That works just as well. I believe this makes your tests more solid. This is a controversial thing. There was some discussion going on Twitter about, well, I changed some class name because it was referenced in my JavaScript, and then my styling broke, and my tests just didn't pick that up because I don't test my styling. Someone else just made a change to an ID in favor of their CSS, and their JavaScript broke. Now, if you do JavaScript testing, you would have known. If you don't, well, you're fucked, basically. So I proposed using data attributes for and IDs for JavaScript and class names for CSS. I blogged about it a few months ago. Usually I have like a maximum of 10 visitors a day on my blog. So that was loud. I tweeted the link once, and posted it to Hacker News myself, because yeah, no one else does it for me. I got like 5,000 reads the first day. Dozens of comments. The people who liked it usually responded on Twitter, like, cool idea. Mostly backend guys. My blog is full of comments with people saying, I'm doing it wrong. I'm a fucking retard. I shouldn't be doing this job. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm essentially killing the internet. I would love to not kill the internet, because it means that we can't Google Bob Ross rainbow unicorn and get epic pictures. Their main argument was, but what about performance? Well, we've heard that before. People are always nagging about performance. It's slower if you use, let me just show you an example. If you use data attributes, in this case, data sex is male. I wanted to use gender, but I didn't fit a line, and I like to say sex during a presentation. So when you use data sex is male, they're both males here, because you have Bob, who's the father, and Steve is his son. Steve continued doing Bob's work, so when you go to bobross.com, you can still order his books, and Steve will take care of it. Steve is awesome too. As you see at the bottom part, you can reference all males by just, and this is jQuery code, use a selector that says, well, data sex is male. If you want all elements that have a sex defined, you could do, well, the bottom one, any gender, take any element which has the data attribute of data sex. This works, especially with jQuery in every browser, on iOS, but also on IE6 and whatnot. Now, the bottom one, your mileage may vary. It's true. All the people who whine about performance were right. It's, in some browsers, it's 90% slower. Instead of a whopping, for instance, in Chrome, I believe, instead of a whopping 100,000 operations per second, it could only do 10,000. So yeah, it's 90% slower. If you consider 10,000 operations per second slow, don't use it. Otherwise, I think if someone has to wait like 50 milliseconds longer, you're probably safe. If you have to support IE6, you maybe should consider not doing this. If you still have to support IE6, you may consider jumping off the highest building you can find, but that's something else altogether. So this is what it looks like, just showed you. When you do this, people might look at you a bit funny, but that's okay. By the way, I'm not making this up. Just go to bobrossquotes.com. It exists, and they're on there, like literally. Like I said, I blogged about it. People looked at me a bit funny. And with a bit funny, I mean they pointed rifles at me and wanted to shoot me. As an interlude, I'd like you to see another exquisite Bob Ross painting of, well, more of the same, basically. That's what I meant by Bob Ross being the inventor of modular painting. He just takes the same elements, rearranges them. Now the trees are behind the lake instead of in front of it. You get like completely new picture, a completely new painting, and that's what you can do in your front end as well. Reuse all those bits and create this awesome painting. Now you need to structure your files in a way that it makes sense. What I do is use one Sass file or one CSS file if you want per module. A module being a Twitter widget, or latest articles, or your header or your footer, for instance. I do the same with my CoffeeScript files. I use one CoffeeScript file per module, and usually they're linked. If I have a Twitter widget or Twitter module that needs JavaScript, I'll have a Twitter Sass file and a Twitter CoffeeScript file. I would love to use one partial per module in Rails, or not. Partials generate I/O. You need to pass stuff to your partials. So I don't do that. HTML is just in my views and not broken up into modules. But do whatever works for you. When you use Sass, sprockets isn't always right. I will see that in a bit. So this could be my structure. I have my application.css.sass. In there I have my base stuff, which is my resets, my grids, my layout defined in there. Then I have a folder with my generic stuff, text styling, that's used all through the document, form styling, buttons, for instance, as shown earlier, and I have my modules like header, article, etc. This is what my application.css.sass looks like. I use Compass for everything because it rocks. I import Compass, apply some resets. I then import all the base modules, all those files that were in base here. Then generic, and then modules. What you could do is just import star. You could use a different glob here. You don't want to do that because they're not imported alphabetically per se. So that doesn't really matter. The order doesn't matter as long as my base styling is in there first, because I may build upon that later, then my generic styling, and then my modules. So that's why I use this, and it works pretty well. Don't use sprockets for this. If you use sprockets to combine multiple Sass files, they won't be aware of each other, and your variable declarations and mixins, for instance, won't work in other Sass files, which is quite instrumental here because everything is split up into multiple files. This is my JavaScript folder. It has one application.js. Then I have some generic styling. If you needed JavaScript for your buttons, for instance, when you hover over it, you'll see tooltip. You can do it with CSS, of course, but if for some reason not, it's in there. And for instance, you have a module for your articles. Here I just use sprockets, require some jQuery stuff, and then again, first require the generic JavaScript and then the JavaScript linked to modules. So when you do that, when you apply all of this, then your code looks like that. No more dead rats, but just awesome Bob. Well, right on time, I think. As Bob used to say at the end of his shows, well, I'll do it like Bob. Well, the little clock on the wall says we're just about out of time. That's what Bob would do. So with that in mind, you can find me on Twitter at Roy. You can read my blog, roytomeij.com. My slides are up at roy.io/WL12. Without the Bob Ross references, sorry for that. I'm this lazy guy that reuses slides. So I'll be redoing this presentation in 2 weeks at Ruby Nation in near Washington in the US. After that, I'll put online the version with the slides, with the Bob Ross images. So I'm open to questions. I think I have like a few minutes left, right?
Sure. Any questions out there?
Please don't say I'm an idiot. Or do.
How do you decide how to name your modules? Is there a naming convention that you like to follow for what the purpose of it?
Not really. I could say common sense, but that's like, my common sense is obviously is above average, so that might not be the best way to describe it. I rename them often. So sometimes I think, well, I got this generic thing here, and I know what the common denominator is, and this makes sense to use this name, and it turns out the same styling is used somewhere else, and then I just change it. So that is like an ongoing process, I guess. I don't have a rule of thumb there. Satisfied? Yes.
So you showed this screen add import, and is it the screen that downloads all those CSS files, like not as one file, but as separate files with a few more HTTP requests?
Yeah. Well, so the question is, what does add import do in the application.css file?
Because I'm not sure how does it work in Sass. Because you said that you should not use brackets because it will just make all those files one file. And I'm not sure how does it work in Sass.
Okay, so the question is, why not use sprockets? How does Sass handle concatenating those files? Sass does exactly the same as sprockets, basically. You end up with one file. No difference there. But those files are still aware. So you can, if you use add import for all of those files, if you first import your file with your variables, then your second Sass file can use those variables. If you use sprockets, that doesn't work because they are not aware of each other's content. Clear?
What's your opinion on CoffeeScript?
I think CoffeeScript rocks.
Can you elaborate?
Why do you have to make simple questions always hard? Well, I mainly like it not as I'm a front-end developer or front-end architect because that just pays more money. I work with a team of back-end developers, and I mainly use CoffeeScript because it's close to Ruby, so it's easier recognizable for them. It's easier to have our back-end developers do front-end work on the JavaScript side and use CoffeeScript for that. And it saves me a ton of typing, of course. So that's the main reason I'm using it.
Are there any CSS frameworks that you can recommend, or maybe you are doing everything by your own?
I bake everything on my own. I don't have any recommendation there. So yeah, that's basically the answer. I don't know shit about CSS frameworks.
Okay.
Last question?
Underscores or hyphens or tangles?
I use underscores. Yes, like the question was underscores or hyphens or camel casing for class names and IDs. I use underscores for a very simple reason. Underscore something and double click it in your text editor, at least on OS X, and it will be selected. When it's hyphenated and click on something, it will only select the part that you double click on. That will save me a crap ton of time. So yeah, that's the only reason why I do it. That's about it, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.